All right, good morning, students. As I promised you in this video, I'm going to explain the squares of opposition, the traditional one and the modern one. Okay. Before I explain the squares of opposition, let me just refresh our memories. In the previous video, we talked about oppositions. These are the relationships between all the four categorical forms, and as I observed, there are 5 different relationships. The first one was contradictory. This relationship says that two categorical forms cannot both be true and cannot both be false. And if you recall, these were the universal affirmative and the particular negative, and also the relationship between the universal negative and the particular affirmative. So, in other words, A and O and also E and I cannot both be true and cannot both be false. They must have opposite truth values. The second is a relationship known as contrary. According to this relationship, 2 propositions, and to be specific, these are the universal propositions. So A and E. A and E cannot both be true, although they may both be false. So once again, to be clear, this means that A and E, A form and E form, cannot both be true by logical necessity. It's impossible that they both be true. However, it is possible, but not necessary, that they are both false. As I said, this is a relationship, the only relationship between the universal statements A and E. The third relationship is subcontrary. Subcontrary is the relationship between the particular statements, I and O. According to the relationship of subcontrary, these 2 forms cannot both be true. They cannot both be false. They may both be true. So once again, by logical necessity, it is impossible that they're both false. If one is false, the other one must be true. However, it is possible, but not necessary, that they're both true. The fourth one is superalternation. According to superalternation, if a particular statement is false, the falsehood of a particular statement implies, okay, so by logical necessity, it is implied that its corresponding universal statement must be also false. Okay? Remember, as I explained it, falsehood travels upward. Falsehood goes up. So by superalternation, if the particular is false, the universal, the corresponding universal, must be false, but not the other way around. What do I mean by corresponding? I mean that the statement I, the form I, some SRP, has a corresponding universal statement, which is the A form, all SRP. And on the other side, you have a particular O form, which has its corresponding universal, which is the E form. And as I said, these are, so I, and if I is false, A must be false, but not the other way around. And if O is false, E is false by logical necessity, but not the other way around. The fifth and last relationship is a relationship between the universal and the particular. Okay, so the previous one, superalternation, is when you go from the bottom to the top, and subalternation is the relationship between the universal statements and their corresponding particular statement. And according to this relationship to subalternation, if the universal statement is true, this implies, okay, by logical necessity, this implies the truth of the particular, but not the other way around. Okay, so if A is true, I must be true, but not the other way around. All right. Okay. Now, let's talk about the traditional and the modern square of opposition. Okay, so this is going to be a short lecture, but intense, I guess, because in order to understand I guess the traditional square of opposition is very easy to understand, but the modern square of opposition is a little bit strange, I have to say. Well, this is my opinion. It's strange. Some other logicians might say, "Why do you think it's strange?" It's not strange. Well, let me show you why. Here is, ta-da, the traditional square of opposition. Now, in the exam, I might ask you to draw the square of opposition and list all the relationships. And you should be able to do it because it's very easy. If you remember, you have A, E, I, and O. So universal, affirmative, universal, negative, particular, affirmative, particular, negative. You have, as you can see, your contradictories. A and O are contradictories. E and I are contradictories. A and E are contraries. They cannot both be true. They may both be false. And subcontraries, I and O, they cannot both be false, but they may both be true. Remember, it's very important. Once again, I'm going to emphasize this once more. Contraries and subcontraries have one logical necessity. The logical necessity of the contraries is that they cannot both be true. It is impossible by logical necessity. But it's not a logical necessity that they may both be false. That's a possibility. Similarly, for the subcontraries by logical necessity cannot both be true, cannot both be false, but they may both be true. It is a possibility, not a necessity. Then you have the, as I just explained, subalternation. So by subalternation, if the universal, as you can see, if I start with a true universal, this implies, by logical necessity, it implies that the particular must be true. So as I said, truth goes down. It never comes up. So if I start with a true I cannot infer anything about A. Same goes on the other side. And another relationship is superalternation. According to superalternation, the falsehood of the particular implies the falsehood of the universal, but not the other way around. Okay, so this is the traditional square of opposition. Now, I hope you noticed something amiss, something actually not amiss, something that shouldn't be there. And that is, if you said that there are too many X's, you're right. Now, I have been talking about the A form and the E form, and I've been using Venn diagrams that do not show an X. Okay? So now why is the X? There is an X inside A and inside E. So what I mean is that there is an X inside the circle representing the subject term in both forms A and E. Why is that? Because according to the traditional square of opposition, according to Aristotle, when I make a universal statement, according to traditional interpretation, my universal statement makes an existential assumption, or also is known as an existential import. Now, the existential assumption, as I explained earlier on in the previous video, the existential assumption is an assumption that the members of the class designated by the subject term do exist, really exist, or they are in existence. So if I say that all bananas are yellow, by placing an X inside, as you can see right here, inside, this is inside the circle S, the subject, bananas, I mean to say that there exist bananas in the world, and there, for example, if I say all bananas are yellow, there exist bananas and they're all yellow. Now the X means, if you remember, that some, at least one banana exists. I mean, sorry, not that one banana exists. It means that bananas exist. And there is at least one that is yellow. Okay? But again, to be clear, the existential assumption makes the assumption that the entities, the members of the class of the subject do exist. Okay? They do exist. Similarly, when look at the E form, when I say that no bananas are yellow, still I make, according to the traditional interpretation, I make an existential assumption. And the assumption is that there exist bananas. However, none of them is yellow, a yellow thing. Naturally, you see that there are X's inside the I form, inside the subject, in the I form and in the O form. Now, those X's, you cannot take them away. You can't, because form I and form O make particular statements. They say that some. And so they require the X in order to make that statement. Without the X's, they could not be some S are P and some S are not P. Okay? So you can't take those away. Now, our problem is with the existential assumption in the universal statements. Why do I say that it is a problem? It is a problem because, once again, in the traditional interpretation, we commit ourselves to the assumption that the members described, designated by the subject, do exist. So if I say bananas, all bananas are yellow, I mean that there exist bananas in the world, and some of them or all of them are yellow. Well, in the case of A, not some, sorry. In the case of A, I mean that that bananas in the world do exist, they are in existence, and all of them are yellow things. Once again, I repeat this many times because I want to make sure that you grasp this idea. The E form, with the existential assumption, according to the traditional interpretation, when I state an E form, an E statement, I thereby state that there exist bananas in the world. But how many bananas are yellow things? None of them. But they do exist. They do exist. Okay. So this square of opposition, the traditional square of opposition, has been adopted by logicians for centuries. Until one point in the modern world, modern logicians observed that there is a problem or several problems with the traditional square of opposition. So let me talk about now the modern square of opposition. So what's the problem with the traditional square of opposition? Well, the traditional square of opposition enables us to make a number of inferences among the forms. However, this relationship, as I said, depends on the existential import. I can make those inferences. Okay, so for example, I can say that if A is true, it follows that E is false, and it follows that O is false. Okay, and it follows that I is true. True, false. Okay. False, true. All right? So if this is true, this is false. If this is false, falsehood goes up and makes E false. And because this is false, the contradictory I is true. So once again, as I said, I'm able to make these inferences. But these inferences depend on the existential import. For modern logicians, as I said, the traditional square of oppositions is problematic because it is, first of all, it is limited. It's limited to certain statements, namely to statements that involve things that really exist. Because obviously, if you are talking about dinosaurs or Martians or triangles, okay, you don't need to commit yourself to the assumption that these entities exist. So when I, for example, if I say to you that all dinosaurs are big animals, or if I say that all Martians are green, or all triangles are geometrical figures that have exactly 3 sides and the internal angles come up to 180 degrees. Now, these entities don't really exist in real life, and yet I can make sense of them. However, if I use the traditional square of opposition, according to a traditional reading, traditional interpretation, I would thereby make an existential assumption, and I would thereby commit myself to the existence of such entities. But that's not what I mean. When I say Martians are green, I don't mean there exist Martians and they're all green. That's not what I want to say. I don't want to say that they exist. Okay, so well, maybe it is possible, you might think, to rescue the traditional interpretation just by using, as long as we use the square only to deal with entities that exist for real. But this move is not going to rescue the traditional square of opposition. And let me explain to you why. Now think about it for a moment. Just take a second to think about this statement. All shoplifters are prosecuted. It's funny that in order for me to make this statement and for the statement to be true, think about it. What do you need for this, in order for this statement to be true? Now, the statement is true just in case there aren't any shoplifters. Okay? So in other words, a statement such as all shoplifters are prosecuted, not only does it deal with entities that do exist, there are shoplifters in the world. However, if I make that statement, if I state all shoplifters are prosecuted, I don't want to commit myself to the assumption that they do exist, because if they do exist, then the statement would be false. Consequently, according to the modern square of opposition, we are not allowed to make the existential assumption. Now, if this sounds confusing, let me explain what I mean again. Let's take the form A. According to the traditional square of opposition, form A states that there exist shoplifters. So if I say all shoplifters are prosecuted, and at the same time I indicate that there are shoplifters in the circle of shoplifters, then I contradict myself, because my statement, all shoplifters are prosecuted, it means that there aren't any shoplifters right here. So this should be, this should be completely shaded. Nothing goes inside. The shoplifters should not exist, according to A. Only things that are prosecuted might exist, and they live in this area. But in this area, you understand, if I say all shoplifters are prosecuted, I contradict myself, because I say that all shoplifters are prosecuted. Consequently, there aren't any shoplifters, but my existential assumption makes the assumption that there are shoplifters. I hope this is clear. Now, I'm not talking about shoplifters in the world. I acknowledge that there are shoplifters in the world, but they shouldn't be inside Area 2, because if they are inside of Area 2, then by saying all shoplifters are prosecuted, I contradict myself, because there it is. at least one. There's the X. The X means there exists at least one shoplifter. But again, my statement requires that there aren't any shoplifters. So how do you deal with these kinds of statements? You can't deal with these kinds of statements unless you employ a new way of thinking of the universal statements. The new way of thinking about the universal statement is that universal statements do not make any existential assumptions, as you can see. So, according to the modern interpretation, if I say something like, all shoplifters are prosecuted, as you can see now, I'm not making an existential assumption. I'm not assuming that there exist shoplifters and at least one is prosecuted. I don't make that assumption because shoplifters, in order to be all prosecuted, no one should be here. No one should be inside here. Similarly, if I say no shoplifters are prosecuted, if there exist shoplifters, because think about it, S is the Venn diagram, is the family of shoplifters. Okay, so if I put an X inside S, what do I mean? I mean that there exists at least one shoplifter. What kind of shoplifter? Shoplifter that is not prosecuted, because P is the category of things that are prosecuted. But if there is a shoplifter and all shoplifters are things that are prosecuted, or no shoplifters are things that are prosecuted, this X, once again, makes my statement false. So I can never be true. Hope that is clear. If it's not clear, I can explain it again. So once again, all shoplifters are prosecuted. What do I need to do in order to make this statement true? I need to avoid an existential assumption, because the existential assumption would say that there exist shoplifters inside here, okay? And also inside here, inside S, the subject, shoplifters, they exist. But when I say that all shoplifters are prosecuted, I don't mean to commit myself to the existence of shoplifters. In fact, if they're all prosecuted, they should not be there. Okay? The existential assumption should not be there. Now, why is the modern square of opposition bare bone like this? Because think about this. Once I remove the existential assumption, once I remove my commitment to the notion that the subject contains members, then all the relationships that we saw earlier, according to the traditional square of opposition, they all disappear, except for one. The contradictory relationship still remains. However, if we are dealing with entities that do not exist, according to the traditional square of opposition, even the contradictories would, the contradictory relationship would disappear, because think about it. What if I say all Martians are blonde? According to the traditional square of opposition, I have an existential assumption. I make an existential assumption that there exist Martians. But if they do not exist, then guess what? the A proposition, the A form, would be false. Now, what about O? Well, you see that O makes an existential assumption that some Martians are not blonde. But if Martians do not exist, some Martians are not blonde would be also false. But according to the traditional square of opposition, A and O must be contradictories. So that means that they must have opposite truth values. And so this is a mistake because they're both false. And according to the traditional square of opposition, they cannot both be false. And they cannot both be true. They must have different opposite truth values. And that's another reason why we in order to preserve at least the contradictory relationship, we must work with a modern square. The modern square does not make the existential assumption. So think about this. Contraries in a traditional square of opposition, namely A and O are contraries. They cannot both be true, but they may both be false. However, if I don't make an existential assumption, okay, I don't commit myself to existence. So when I say that all Martians are blonde, I don't mean that there exist Martians. I only mean if, see, the modern square of opposition takes a different attitude. It doesn't make an existential claim. It only makes a hypothetical claim. So when I state an A proposition according to the modern square of opposition, what I'm doing is I'm only saying if there are things that respond to the name of Martians, they're all blonde. So such a proposition, if I consider it as true, well, it would be trivially true. There's nothing there to confirm its truth. Consequently, if I say that no Martians are blonde, according to the modern square of opposition, this is also true because there aren't any Martians that are blonde. So as you can see, since A and E are contraries according to the traditional square of opposition, according to the modern square of opposition now, they can no longer be contraries because they can both be true. But according to the relationship of contrary, two propositions cannot both be true. Now, same story goes for the subcontraries. If I deal with an entity that does not exist, for example, Martians, proposition I says some Martians are blonde. Proposition O says some Martians are not blonde. But think about this. Since Martians do not exist, and proposition I is making an existential assumption, then I would be false. Okay? And what about O? O will be false too, because it is false that there exist Martians and some of them are not blonde. This would be false too. But if you remember, the rule about subcontraries is that they cannot both be false. But as you can see, if Martians don't exist, I and O can both be false. And that violates the rule of subcontrary. Consequently, we have to remove completely that relationship. What about the other two relationships, subalternation and superalternation? Well, think about it. If it is true that if it's true that all Martians are blonde, then it cannot be true that some Martians are blonde. Why is that? Because according to the traditional square of opposition, I don't mean by saying that all Martians are blonde that there exist Martians. I only say a hypothetical statement. If there are things with they respond to the name of Martians, if they exist, then they are all blonde. However, I form makes a different statement. I form is committed to the existence. Okay? So if this is true, if A is true, then I is false. But remember that by subalternation, the truth of the universal implies, by logical necessity, the truth of the particular. But in this case, as I demonstrated, A can be true and I can be false. Consequently, subalternation no longer exists. What about superalternation? Well, superalternation says that the truth of the particular implies, the falsehood of the particular implies the falsehood of the universal. However, if I is false, this does not imply that A is false. As I demonstrated a second ago, A can be true, okay? But according to superalternation, it is a logical necessity that if I is false, A must also be false. But that's not the case. Consequently, again, the last relationship is gone. And so we are left with the modern square of opposition, and we had to pay a price for the existential assumption. So no existential assumption, no contraries, no subcontraries, no superalternation, no subalternation. The only relationship that is preserved is the contrary. And think about it. It makes sense. If it's true that all Martians are blonde, then it is false that some Martians exist and some of them are not blonde. Why? Because, well, Martians don't exist. So the X makes this statement false. And what about this? Vice versa. If the A proposition is false, then its contradictory must be true. So in other words, if it is false that all Martians are blonde, then it must be true that some Martians are not blonde. Okay? So as you can see, it is by removing the existential assumption that I can preserve the only relationship, the relationship of contradictory. I hope this was clear enough. If it's not clear, make sure that you ask me questions. I can go over this again. You have a textbook. The textbook also explains this, the traditional and the modern square of opposition. You're supposed to work some exercises on your textbook. I list the pages on my syllabus. If you have other questions, please contact me and let me know. And thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.